When I was younger, around 8 or 9, I went over to my best friend's house for a sleepover. Her parents had recently just gone through a messy divorce, and her mom reached out to mine and thought it was a good idea she had some friends to spend the night with, since she was apparently experiencing frequent night terrors. I only found out about this until later on. We'll refer to her as L, so there's about 6 of us, and we're in L's attic spending the night. After all the junk food and gossip, we decided to sleep since it was around 3 a.m. Right before deciding to sleep, Elle mentioned the reason why her parents were getting a divorce is because her dad cheated on her mom with the mom's hairdresser, and the mom kicked him out and changed all the locks. She said she was scared of him showing up because of how loud he would always yell. I felt so sorry for her having to go through that. We all tried to make her feel better and safe, but then decided it was time to sleep. I'm usually the last one to fall asleep, so as I was drifting off, I feel someone nudging my shoulder, asking if I'm okay, and I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" Still with my eyes closed. And the person says, "Wake up. Don't sleep yet. I can't sleep." So I opened my eyes to see Elle standing above me with her eyes closed. Told her she already looked like she's asleep and to go back to bed because I'm too sleepy. She nudged my shoulder again, then started crying loudly and walked away to her side of the attic and went back in her bed. I looked around thinking everyone would wake up for sure, but no one did, and she stopped crying as soon as she got into bed. I stayed there frozen for so long thinking she would wake up again or do something different. Then I got worried, so I walked over to her side and happened to look outside the window to see a man standing by the tree in their front yard, just standing in all black, and looked like he was waiting. I never made it to her side to check on her. I sprinted back to where I was and just sat there. Needless to say, I never slept that night, and to this day, I'm still confused as to why no one else woke up when she cried, and why she made it to my side without making any noise, seeing as the floor creaked a lot anytime someone moved. She had no idea what I was talking about when I asked her in the morning. Her mom denied everything. I felt like I was going crazy until my mom explained to her night terrors to me. She freaked when I told her about the man waiting outside. We assumed it was Elle's dad, but who knows. When my daughter was about 6 weeks old, I woke up to the inside laundry door banging. Now, my husband often left the laundry window open to avoid condensation when the dryer was on, so I assumed it was the wind. But the baby was fussing, so I got up to change her. I had this really bad feeling, but she was fussing, so after hesitating at the bedroom door, I went out to change her anyway because I figured I was just paranoid. Bad dream or something. As I step out the door, I hear this really loud bang of the door. Stuck my head around the corner, and sure enough, it was the laundry door. So I finished changing Hububs, get her settled into bed again, and go and shut the laundry window. Go back to bed. When I got up the next morning, I found muddy footprints all over the lounge room carpet, and our Wii and some other stuff was missing. I realized that when I got up, I disturbed whoever had broken into our house. If I hadn't hesitated at the door, I would have run right into them. God knows what might have happened. I had nightmares for months. Man, that feeling of dread. I've only had it once, but I wasn't alone. I was working in retail liquor in a shop at the entrance to a mall. It was a Thursday night, and I was there with the manager, who was a couple years older than me. I was standing at the counter doing some ordering when suddenly I got this feeling of ominous dread. It felt like a vice on my chest. I looked up, and all I could see was people walking out of the mall with their shopping. No one out of the ordinary. The feeling didn't subside, and I was about to go and talk to the manager when she walked up to the counter and, without saying a word, took all the cash and the change tin and put it in the safe in the back room. She came out to the counter, looked at me, and said, "You feel that too, huh?" We stood there for about 5 minutes as the feeling got worse and worse, and suddenly it was gone. It was like a breeze had blown it away. We both let out a massive sigh and went back to work. She then told me she'd gotten that feeling once before when the store she was working at previously was robbed by a guy wielding a knife. That's why she moved the cash. I have no idea what caused it, but I like to think someone was about to rob us but then decided not to. It was truly bizarre. So, this happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, winding driveway. We had been there all day and her mom had gone out. She and I were supposed to go meet a couple of friends in Hollywood that night. Anyways, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies at whatnot, and we started to get ready. Bathroom had one of those his/her double sink deals, so she was near one and I was at the other. All of a sudden, I got the creepiest feeling, like all of the hair on my arms stood up, and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day, it was the most terrified I've ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened, and I caught her eye in the mirror and said, "We need to leave, right now." I thought she would be like, "What? You're being ridiculous," or what have you. But instead, she said, "I know." My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We booked it out of her house and down the driveway, which we weren't supposed to be on, because her mom had just had it repaved. Her car was parked down the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway and there was a SUV parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly the lights turned on full blast. The SUV blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, totally ruining the new paving, and were getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day I do not know if it was a robber or what. The fact that she and I both got the sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out to no end. When I was 26 and 6 months pregnant, I went to my dad's house to pick up his mail. My dad was working overseas, but my older and more irresponsible brother was still living there. I had noticed his car was gone, so when I entered the house and heard movement in his room upstairs, I thought it was his girlfriend. As I was rummaging through the mail, I noticed the movement upstairs had stopped, and I heard the floorboards creaking as if someone was trying not to be noticed. Something told me to hide, so I ran down the hall to my dad's room and saw that his window was broken and glass was all over his floor. As I was realizing this, I heard the stairs creaking, so I ran to my dad's bathroom. From there, I had a clear view down the hall to a wall where the landing from the stairs was, and I could see unfamiliar legs with long black basketball shorts and the bottom of a large red t-shirt standing there, starting to slowly bend as if to quietly peek down the hall into a room to escape back out of the house through the broken window. Thankfully, he took a chance and ran out the front door. Luckily enough, I didn't lock the front door behind me as I usually do. I don't know what I would have done if I would have had to confront him. It makes me sick to try to imagine the fear a child would have in that situation. Though I grew up in Southwest Houston, which is no stranger to gang activity, especially young teenagers/adults trying to rep street gangs like the Bloods, hence the red shirt. I had never had any negative experiences. However, after that day, I never went back to my dad's house without my husband or brother there. I was born and raised in the country outside a small northeastern Indiana town. I lived in a house that my great-great-great-great-grandfather and his brothers built, as well as 4 other homes directly around my house, where his brothers and their wives lived back in their time. So, by the time I lived in it as a child, it was well into 100 years old, and it had been remodeled by my grandma and grandpa in the 1970s. So before he lived there, my maternal grandparents lived there. My grandpa was diagnosed with idiopathic cystic fibrosis of the lungs way back in the early 1980s. I was born in 1989, and in 1990, he was blessed with receiving the first lung transplant in northern Indiana. At a very young age, I have 2 distinct memories of him being home, with oxygen tubes in his nose, and pulling his oxygen tank around the house to sit in his favorite rocker recliner. He passed away in 1991 from rejection. So the creepy part. Back in 2006, I was pregnant with my first child and near my due date. It was during the day and I was really uncomfortable. My hips and lower back were hurting. So I decided to drive to mom and dad's and take a nap in their waterbed, thinking the heat may help. So I get there, and mom and I sat in the kitchen, off from the living room, to talk for a few minutes. During a lull in the conversation, I distinctly hear a squeak, squeak, like squeaky tires. I kind of nonchalantly look around to see where the noise could be coming from. I don't see anything. I glance at my mom and she's looking around too. Right as I'm about to ask her if she hears that, I see from the corner of my eye a figure walk past the entryway to the kitchen, walking into the living room. Since I was already looking at mom, hence why I saw it out of the corner of my eye, I could see she definitely saw something, as well as her eyes got that deer in the headlights look, and her face went pale. She looked at me and put her finger over her closed mouth like a shh sound. We both stood up quietly and walked to the kitchen, living room, hall, entryway, and looked into the living room. In the living room, the rocker recliner mom had was rocking back and forth like someone was sitting in it rocking. I looked at mom with a "Are you seeing this?" expression, just in time to see her hands fly up to her open mouth. I snap my head back around and plainly see my dead, for at this time 15 plus years, grandfather sitting in the chair, rocking for about 2 rocks. I quickly glance back at mom to make sure she's seeing this, and look back, and he was gone, and the chair was completely still. Legit freakiest thing that has ever happened to me. Was not scared, was just in disbelief. So glad my mom was there, or I would have thought I'd gone insane. Story 2 is completely different. Lived in the same house, except this time I was around 8 to 9, and me and my sister's room were upstairs in our house. My parents' room was downstairs. This particular night, I was sick, and my parents let me sleep on the couch in the living room. Somewhere around 3 to 4 a.m., I remember waking up because I heard someone come in the front door, which opens directly into the living room. I remember opening my eyes to see someone walking through the living room and into the kitchen, and I seemingly fell back asleep for a few minutes. The next thing I knew, I was woken up to red and blue lights flashing through the house. Then I hear my dad and mom's hushed whispers and dad arguing with what sounded like another man. Again, young me just fell back to sleep. Come to find out the next morning, apparently a man who was fleeing the cops pulled into our driveway and walked into our house. Was trying to convince my dad to tell the cops he was his dad and that this was his house. Dad definitely did not do that, and the guy ended up in jail. This didn't happen directly to me, but is still one of the most unsettling events to happen to my family. I was 10 and my brother was 7. During these years, we shared a room with bunk beds. We lived in a 3-bedroom, 2-story apartment. One night, my mother was out on the front porch reading. My little brother runs up to the front door, soaking wet and in his underwear. I understand that the front door was the only possible way he could have gotten outside, and it was locked and deadbolted. He was too small to unlock the ground story windows, and my mother was facing the sliding glass doors, which no one came through. The only remotely accessible second-story windows were locked from the inside. Right after he ran up to the front door, a college-aged kid rode up on his bicycle. Apparently, he had been riding home from work and saw my brother standing in the sprinklers in the elementary school next door to the apartment complex we live in. When he called out to my brother stared and after a few seconds ran off back home. From what my father says about that night, there was literally no way he could have gotten to the front door and unlocked the deadbolt. My dad was in the front hall working on a bookshelf right in front of the front door from the time he put us to sleep to the time my brother arrived. The only things my brother remembers from that night are going to sleep, a bright light, and waking up at the school. The event itself is crazy as shit, but what unnerves me is that anyone could have found my brother, but luckily it was a normal, concerned person. I was in Vegas last year with my brother. Both like to party hard, still in our 20s. Walking down the strip, I see 2 guys with backpacks on. I know what that means. I say, damn, wish we had some weed. They immediately turn around and offer us other things as well. We took down his number to get other things later in the night. Hours later, after tons and tons of booze and stuff, we called this guy up for more. When we met these two guys, they were on foot. The second time, though, we had to meet them in front of a hotel because they were driving. So he tells us to hop in for a few so we can get what we need without people watching. Now, at this point, my brother and I are fucked up and don't realize what's happening until it starts to get dark. We'd only been driving for 10 minutes, but we were obviously off the strip, away from the lights, people, anything. This guy is driving like a goddamn maniac, with music blasting, so it was a bit distracting. My brother finally asked them where we are going. They say we're heading to a liquor store real quick, and then they'll drop us back off, but it seems like we're in the middle of nowhere. Finally realizing the situation we're in, we open the doors while we're stopped at a light and run to the only thing we see, a gas station. We flagged down a cab that drove by a few minutes later, which he says is illegal, but we were obviously in need of help. After we told him what happened, he calmly tells us, "There is no liquor store over here." It was the worst and best feeling ever. We narrowly escaped God knows what and stayed silent for the rest of the night. Too long didn't read. Don't get into the car with strangers, especially while under the influence. Some years back now, my mom went on a vacation with a friend of hers to Florida or somewhere for a week and a half during the winter. So I was alone at home for the time and took advantage of it by setting up my consoles on the big living room TV. One night it was snowing, and throughout the night I felt really uncomfortable. Granted, this was day 6 of 11, and I've never actually been alone in the house for that long before. So I just chalked it up to loneliness. The snow stopped sometime in the middle of the night, and I went to sleep on the couch around 2 a.m. Next morning, plows came down the street and cleared them up as usual. I had left to pick up some stuff at the store down the street, but I stopped almost immediately when I got off my porch. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the large bay window on the side of the house, set leading towards and away. The ones leading in were slightly filled from the snowfall, yet there were 2 footprints positioned right next to the far corner of the window, close to the rear porch, and some largish bushes that were finely detailed and pointed towards the wall. Someone had been standing outside the window for a while, at least, staring into my house, and left when the snow stopped. The tracks started and ended at the street, so where they came from and where they went afterwards were destroyed by the plows. I've since bought large tin sheets to cover said window, hung thick, dark curtains, and rearranged furniture to cover the entire bottom 1/3 of the entire window length. Fuck that shit ever again. I'm a 31-year-old man, and the idea of someone just staring into my house through the windows gives me the kind of tense, anxious horror I felt when I almost fell off a 15-foot cliff. Can't even sit by windows at night without fully closing curtains. When my friend's dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were fornicating in some bushes and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour, they decided they should probably go look for them, and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting wood. They saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, and report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with one driver and 2 faces pressed up against the window, which they believed were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. I saw a man get shot pretty much point blank in the face in the early 2000s. I was in a bar in Moscow waiting for a friend, chatting with the bartender. I hear a commotion next to me as I see a guy take a step back, whip out a gun, point at a guy's face, and pull a trigger. The guy just slumped and hit the floor, and that's when I saw blood. Immediate ringing in the ears, screams, and folks froze as we thought this guy will continue shooting. Turns out the guy was in the police force and shot this guy as he was part of some sort of gang who have murdered another cop from his station. I was around 10, very early 90s. We've just moved to Moscow from a small town in Siberia and bought new furniture. Turns out the furniture store forgot one of the items and said that someone will drop it off tomorrow. Not uncommon in Russia, kids were okay being home alone even at 10. So I'm home after school when two dudes knock on the door carrying a box saying that they're from the furniture store. They were not. I got tied up and roughed up and they robbed the house clean but left me alive. I was able to identify one of them a year later while the other one was killed in a car accident. Karma's a bitch. The first guy got 7 years of hard labor and I'm sure has been releasing silent farts from the first day there. Also Moscow 93, when Yeltsin decided to fire upon the Duma. Just the amount of dead people laid out to be identified by their relatives, wailing mothers and wives. The smell of burnt rubber and crackling glass under feet. What struck me the most was how there would be a janitor next to some bigwig politicians laying there, side by side with their head propped up on the brick wall, all equal in death. That one scared me for a while, as of course my friend and I snuck out without our parents knowing. I guess the lesson learned there was that at the end of the game, all chess pieces go into the same box. I went to see a movie with a friend of mine. It was dark when we got out of the movie, and she offered me a ride home, but it was a pretty short walk, nice night, and I live in a really safe town, usually. So I start to walk home. I guess I should mention I'm a woman, and a particularly small one. About 2 blocks into my walk, I hear yelling and screaming and moaning. I look and these two guys in hoodies are kicking something, but I can't see what because there is the short cement wall blocking my view. They shout something, not at me, take off in the opposite direction, so I run to where they had been. That all happened very quickly. I get there and there's this homeless man. It's really dark, but he's obviously hurting badly. He has a blanket. He was clearly sleeping when these guys came up and attacked him. I actually recognized him, not by name, but it is a small town and I've seen him around. He gets up and grabs his blanket and looks around for a minute. I try to talk to him, but he just can't really talk to me. He's quite mentally ill and has now been hit in the head. He's just terrified. He takes a couple of steps as I'm calling 911 and ends up under the streetlight. His head and face are covered in blood with some dirt caked over it, to the point I can't see any skin on his face. He's way too spooked to let me try to help. I'm explaining to 911 the situation, but mostly just begging for an ambulance. They want to know about the two guys, of course, but I didn't see them well and I have this guy bleeding from his head in front of me. And then he starts walking. I have no way to stop him, so I just follow a little bit behind because I don't want to be an extra thing that terrifies him, but I also need to update 911 where we are. We made it like 8 blocks before the fire truck intercepted us. I'm shocked he makes it that far. No one else is out. 911 keeps wanting me to give more detailed description, which is the one point I lost it a little bit. He's the only one guy covered in blood walking down the street name. Sorry, 911 operator. I cannot describe how relieved I was when the fire truck showed up. The police talked to me for a little bit, then they left. The guy had been transported and the fire truck was gone. All of a sudden everyone was gone and I was just standing there on an empty street in the dark. I took a step to start to walk home, now farther than where I started. I decided to call my friend instead. She drove back and took me home. The guy with the head injury lived. The two terrible humans who did that were never caught. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so, about 4 miles out of town, so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years I worked there on a 56-hour shift, come in on a Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts, and we were both supposed to be there for the entire 56 hours, but because we were most senior trainers on staff, we'd take turns going home on 1 or 2 of the nights. After 3 years of being in that house, I'd become comfortable with it, despite it being isolated and overall kind of creepy. I'd always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. The client was always locked in his room around 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 a.m., I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep on the nastiest futon ever. There was one window in the staff room, and it faced the back of the property and was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling woman's scream from right outside the window. It popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door, illuminating the area outside the window. There was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw nothing. I watched the sun come up in the next morning, desperately glued to the TV, trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me. There was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January in eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it bothers me to this day. Not necessarily paranormal, but this was something that both creeped me out quite thoroughly and chilled my blood to ice water. I was working at a crematory funeral home at the time. I had just picked up the body of a girl my age from the county coroner's office and was going through the check-in procedure, which consisted of lots of paperwork, fingerprints, documentation of belongings, etc. Now, when a body comes to us from the coroner, it's typically an unexpected death that occurred under questionable circumstances. This particular one, I could tell by simply looking at her, was a drug overdose. She had very obvious injection sites in her arms, thigh, and on her foot, and what appeared to be needle marks all over her lower abdomen. It looked like this chick went to fucking town, stabbing herself in the belly. This is strange to me, because I know that isn't a typical place to inject drugs, especially because this girl was a bit on the large side, nor is it usually a place where the pathologist will draw fluids in a case like this. Anyway, I shrugged it off and began to document her personal items, which come to us zipped up in the body bag in a black trash bag. Usually the coroner's office provides a detailed list of belongings for liability reasons. This case came with no such list, so it surprised me to see that she did indeed have a property bag with her, tucked under her leg. I tore the bag open and out flopped a fully developed, completely green, dead baby with a very smooshed head. You can imagine my shock, opening the bag, expecting to find shoes, clothes, maybe a wallet, and instead a tiny human plopping out. Long story short, the family did not know, and telling them was horrifying in and of itself. There was absolutely no sort of documentation on this fully developed human, and the coroner was just as shocked as we were. Some jackass autopsy tech had just stuffed the baby in a bag in hopes of us not finding it and cremating it to save themselves some time on paperwork when dealing with an already distraught family. Autopsy was done on the baby, family and friends were questioned, the whole 9 yards. Later, a friend of the deceased disclosed that she was the only one who the girl told about being pregnant and her plans to try and give herself a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin straight into her womb. Pretty fucked. Needless to say, I was always hesitant when opening property bags in fear of finding another dead, green infant as opposed to a pair of Nikes. I was home for the summer from college. My mother and brother had just headed out for a few day trip to visit colleges. This meant I was to take care of my father. Dad, something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's, but it was more than that. But we figured I could handle him. This is when I came to realize something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now I admit I was pissed off, so I wasn't doing a terrific job, but even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended up with us shouting. This last time I called Mom in the house phone because at least he'd listen to her. I gave him one phone and I was on another, yelling at each other through it even though we were 5 feet apart. Poor Mom trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, Dad hangs up his phone and hands it to me. Oh, he's done, thank God, I think. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse, and that's when it happens. It gives me the chills to this day. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood slightly straighter. It was like for a moment someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I've ever heard, said, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it. There was no energy. He said it as a fact. I was stunned. Mom heard it over the phone. As I stood there, paralyzed, her voice broke through in a whisper. "Key, run." I threw the phone at Dad, rounded the corner, and grabbed my keys. My car screamed out the driveway. It was pure animal instinct for me at that point. I had to run, because if I stayed there... Dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I stared into something back there